Step into the eastern woodlands in 1640 and the first thing you'll notice isn't the majesty of the ancient pines. It is the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a nature documentary, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a room where someone has just been murdered. The air smells of charred hickory and damp earth, but beneath it there is the metallic tang of dried blood and the acrid bite of spent black powder. You've been sold a story of the North American interior as a vast, untouched Eden, a place where people lived in stagnant harmony with the trees until the European arrival broke the spell. The metal is good, but it's a comfortable narrative, but it treats the indigenous people as characters in a fable rather than what they actually were. Master strategists, high-performance warriors, and cold-eyed geopoliticians. The woods were a chessboard, and by the mid-7th century, one side had decided to flip the table. They were the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations of the Iroquois. They didn't just fight. They industrialized the hunt and weaponized grief. They were an organic syndicate that realized faster than anyone else that in a world of global trade, you either become the monopoly or you become the waste. Today, we are looking at the Beaver Wars through the lens of a total war audit. We're stripping away the romanticism to see the raw mechanical genius of the American Rome. An empire built on fur, lead, and the terrifying reclamation of human life. Long before the first Dutch trader stepped into the Hudson Valley, the Haudenosaunee had solved the most difficult problem of human organization. They had synchronized their violence. While other tribal groups operated as loose collections of villages, the Iroquois were a unified political machine. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cauga, and Seneca operated under a single constitutional framework, the Great Law of Peace. But do not mistake peace for pacifism. This was a non-aggression pact between the 5 fingers so they could strike together as a single devastating fist. By the 1630s, this fist was looking for a target. The catalyst was the Castor canadensis, the North American beaver. To the Europeans, the beaver pelt was a luxury commodity for the fashion houses of London and Paris. To the Iroquois, it was a strategic currency. They understood the new economic ledger immediately. Pelts were the only way to acquire the tools of modern survival. Metal kettles that could be melted into arrowheads, not steel knives that didn't shatter like flint, and most importantly the flintlock musket. While the French to the north tried to keep firearms out of the hands of their Huron allies, the Dutch at Fort Orange were happy to trade lead and powder for fur. The Iroquois saw the gap in the market. They realized that if they could control the flow of fur from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, they would become the supreme power on the continent. But there was one problem. They had already hunted their own lands to exhaustion. The math was simple. To get the guns, they needed the pelts. To get the pelts, they had to take the hunting grounds of their neighbors. And to do that, they would have to erase every rival confederacy from the map. There is a visceral reality to Iroquois warfare that modern history often tries to bury because it is too dark for a textbook. It's called the Morning War. We honor thee in the 1630s and 40s. The Haudenosaunee weren't just losing men to the warpath. They were being liquidated by a microscopic enemy. Smallpox and measles, invisible stowaways on European ships, were tearing through the longhouses. In some Seneca villages, half the population vanished in a single season. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophic failure of the labor force and the military framework. The Iroquois response wasn't to mourn with tears. They mourned with raids. When a clan matriarch lost a son or a daughter, she didn't just grieve. She demanded a req. She would present the warriors with a belt of wampum and a command. Go into the woods and bring me back a replacement. The goal of the war shifted from territory to the literal reclamation of human capital. If you were a Huron or an Erie warrior captured by an Iroquois war party, your identity was about to be audited in the most brutal way imaginable. You would be marched back to their village, subjected to a ritual of sensory and physical torture designed to break your connection to your old life. If you survived and if you showed the necessary resilience, you weren't killed. You were adopted. You were given the name of the deceased family member. You were given their clothes, their seat in the longhouse, and their responsibilities. You ceased to be a Huron. You became a Seneca. This was a demographic blitzkrieg. The Iroquois were physically absorbing their enemies, swallowing entire tribes to keep their own numbers from crashing. They didn't just defeat you, they consumed you until your lineage became theirs. By 1648, the Haudenosaunee had decided that the time for small-scale raids was over. It was time for a total somatic liquidation of their primary rival, the Wendat-Huron Confederacy. The winter was plent. The Wendat were the kings of the northern trade, the middlemen for the French. They were numerous, well-fortified and powerful. But the Iroquois had spent the last decade accumulating a terrifying arsenal. While the French priests were busy converting the Wendat and discouraging the use of heathen weapons, the Iroquois had acquired over 800 muskets from the Dutch. In the winter of 1649, Jai the Iroquois did the unthinkable. In the deep sub-zero cold of the Great Lakes winter, a time when war was supposed to be impossible, over 1,000 Mohawk and Seneca warriors moved north on snowshoes. This was a high-speed kinetic strike. They didn't wait for the spring. They hit the Wendat villages of St. Agnos and St. Louis. While they were still in their winter slumber, the result was a slaughter that redefined the geography of the continent. The Iroquois didn't just take the furs. They burned the long houses, destroyed the food stores, and executed the leadership. The Wendat Confederacy, a nation of 30,000 people, collapsed in weeks. The survivors fled into the freezing woods, dying of exposure or surrendering to the Iroquois to avoid starvation. The forest was no longer a home. It was a slaughterhouse. The Haudenosaunee had cleared the board. In the following years, they turned their attention to the Pun, the Neutrals, and the Erie. One by one, these ancient confederacies were erased. By 1655, the Iroquois had created a dead zone of hundreds of miles around their territory, a buffer of empty woods where no one dared to hunt without their permission. The Iroquois didn't achieve this empire through luck. They achieved it through a terrifying mastery of the environment and psychological warfare. They were the inventors of the forest guerrilla style that would haunt European armies for the next 2 centuries. A Mohawk war party didn't move like a line of soldiers. They moved like a shadow. They could travel 50 miles a day through the densest brush, peering out of the mist to deliver a devastating volley of lead and then vanishing before the smoke cleared. They utilized the tomahawk and the ball-headed club, a heavy wooden weapon designed to shatter a skull with a single kinetic impact. With a proficiency that turned every close-quarters encounter into a visceral nightmare, they weaponized fear. They would leave the bodies of their enemies in specific horrifying displays along the river routes to ensure that any survivor who escaped would spread the message. The woods belonged to the Haudenosaunee. The French, supposed masters of the New World, found themselves barricaded in their forts at Quebec and Montreal, unable to step 100 yards past the palisades without risking a knife to the throat. The Iroquois had effectively paralyzed a European superpower. By the late 1600s, the Iroquois had become more than just a tribal union. They were a sovereign power playing the English and the French against each other with the sophistication of a European cabinet. They created the covenant chain, a complex system of alliances that allowed them to dictate terms to the colonial governors. They understood that the Europeans were just another resource to be audited. They would trade with the English to spite the French, then sign a peace treaty with the French to keep the English in check. They were the gatekeepers of the continent's interior. No one moved a pelt, a soldier, or a barrel of powder through the eastern woodlands without the consent of the Onondaga Council. This wasn't a story of people being swept away by the tide of history. This was a story of a people who seized the tide. She redirected it and rode it to the height of imperial power. They had taken the technology of the invader, the gun, the steel, the trade, and used it to forge an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and from the St. Lawrence to the Carolinas. We like to talk about the clash of cultures as a process of European dominance. But for over a century, the reality was the exact opposite. The interior of North America was an Iroquois world. The very names of the places we inhabit, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, are haunted by the memory of their blitzkrieg. The Beaver Wars were a cold, calculated administration of violence. The Haudenosaunee saw a world that was changing, and they decided to be the ones who defined that change. They didn't mourn the passing of the old ways. They built a new, too terrifying framework of survival. They turned their grief into a motor and their economic need into a sword. In the end, the empire wasn't broken by the French or the English. It was broken by the same thing that broke every empire: internal friction and the overwhelming grinding weight of a larger machine. But for 100 years, the Iroquois were the undisputed masters of the dark woods. When you walk through those forests today, remember that the ground beneath you was once the most contested ledger on Earth. The silence isn't natural. It was earned. It is the lingering echo of a century where 5 nations merged into one fist and decided that the forest would either be theirs or it would be empty. The frontier does not reward the peaceful. It rewards the organized, the ruthless, and those who understand the price of the ground they stand on. They built no stone cities. Their empire was not measured in static walls, but in the rapid deployment of force and the efficient harvesting of Spanish resources. They were the apex predators of the plains. If you look at the map of North America in the 18th century, you will see the heavy, rigid lines of European ambition. The Spanish crown was obsessed with weight. They dragged limestone and timber across the unforgiving deserts of Novo, Mexico, and Tejas to build massive presidios and towering missions. They believed that power was derived from mass. They believed that if you anchored yourself to the earth with enough stone, you could tame the wilderness. They were catastrophically wrong. While the Spanish were sweating and dying to build forts that couldn't move, a group of Shoshonean hunter-gatherers descended from the Rocky Mountains and performed a total systemic override of the Great Plains. They were the Numanu, the Comanche. They looked at the heavy static world of the Europeans and realized a fundamental truth of the American interior. Weight is a liability. They did not want to conquer the earth. They wanted to skim across it. By integrating an abandoned European technology, the horse, into their daily existence, the Comanche broke the ancient rules of survival. They created a civilization composed entirely of motion. They were a decentralized, high-speed logistical network that treated the rigid Spanish Empire as a self-stocking grocery store and the surrounding indigenous tribes as raw material. Today, we are conducting a deep clinical examination of the Comanche machine. We are stripping away the sanitized myths to witness the raw mechanical genius of the only true equestrian empire in North America. We are going to see how they mastered terrain bypass to render borders meaningless, how they utilized mobile procurement to tax an entire continent, and crucially the hidden fragility that made their engines so vulnerable. This is the story of what happens when a people decide to weaponize the wind. To comprehend the sheer scale of the Comanche ascension, you must first look at the harsh physics of the Great Plains before the year 1680. For thousands of years, the human experience on the southern plains was defined by crushing friction. The landscape, particularly the vast waterless expanse of the Llano Estacado, the staked plains, was a lethal environment for a creature walking on 2 legs. The energy cost to cross this ocean of grass was immense. A human hunter on foot operated on a razor-thin caloric margin. You tracked a bison for days, burning massive amounts of energy, hoping the kill would yield enough protein to replace what you had just spent. It was an economy of absolute scarcity. You were chained to the riverbeds, unable to project power or accumulate wealth. Then came the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The indigenous people of New Mexico violently expelled the Spanish. And in the chaos, thousands of Spanish horses were released into the wild. When the Comanche encountered the horse, they did not just see a beast of burden. They recognized it as a living refinery. The horse possesses a digestive tract capable of breaking down cellulose. The tough, fibrous prairie grass that is completely indigestible and useless to a human stomach. The horse takes that infinite sea of useless grass and converts it into high-octane kinetic energy. By mastering the horse, the Comanche executed a total upgrade of their civilization. They bypassed the human limitations of endurance and speed. Suddenly, the unusable wasteland of the Llano Estacado became the richest energy source on the planet. The Comanche transformed from a marginal band of mountain foragers into a high-performance equestrian elite. They moved down onto the southern plains because that was where the fuel was. While other tribes kept small herds for occasional hunting, the Comanche completely restructured their society around the animal. They became a mounted economy of surplus. They bred, stole, and traded horses until they possessed herds numbering in the tens of thousands. They moved their camps with the seasons, chasing the best grass to ensure their organic engines were always fueled. This mastery granted them their first great strategic advantage, terrain bypass. The Spanish military was chained to supply lines and roads. The Comanche were not. A Comanche war party could cross hundreds of miles of barren, waterless desert that European maps marked as impassable. They carried water in the intestines of bison, drank the blood of their horses if necessary, and emerged from the empty spaces to strike deep behind enemy lines. The Spanish built walls to block the roads, but the Comanche simply went around them. The environment was their highway and no static empire could police it. Because the Comanche were entirely mobile, they had zero interest in the traditional metrics of statecraft. States are heavy. States require agriculture, which ties you to a single plot of dirt. States have cities, which serve as fixed points of failure that enemies can besiege or burn. The Comanche recognized that if you remain in constant motion, you are effectively untouchable. They looked at the Spanish settlements in New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico not as rival sovereign territories, but as living warehouses. The Spanish were doing the brutal, back-breaking labor of digging wells, planting corn, and raising cattle and sheep. The Comanche saw no reason to replicate this labor. Why farm when you can simply harvest the farmers? This was the doctrine of mobile procurement. The Comanche established an annual rhythm of extraction. Every autumn, under the bright guiding light of the Comanche moon, hundreds of warriors would ride south. They would bypass the heavy stone presidios entirely, slipping through the gaps in the Spanish defensive network to strike the sprawling haciendas and ranches of Chihuahua and Coahuila with surgical precision. Their objective was extraction. They would kill the men who resisted, burn the static infrastructure, and round up thousands of horses, mules, and cattle. By the time the Spanish garrison managed to saddle their mounts, the Comanche were already 50 miles away, driving their newly acquired assets back into the impenetrable depths of the Comancheria. But livestock was only half of the harvest. The Comanche also extracted human capital. A nomadic warrior society comes with a high mortality rate. To sustain their empire, the Comanche required a constant influx of fresh genetic material and labor. They solved this through the mass kidnapping of Spanish and Mexican women and children. These captives were processed through a brutal psychological crucible designed to erase their previous identity and integrate them into the Comanche machine. A Mexican boy captured at the age of 8 would be subjected to severe discipline, taught the Comanche language, and trained to ride and shoot. By 18, the boy who used to go to Mass in San Antonio was now a Comanche warrior, fully integrated, participating in raids against his former people. This demographic recycling program was ruthlessly efficient, allowing the Comanche to constantly replenish their ranks. By the mid-700s, the Spanish authorities were effectively paying the Comanche protection money in the form of regular tributes, guns, lead, sugar, and cloth, just to keep the raiding parties away. The supposedly primitive nomads were taxing the most powerful maritime empire on Earth. To enforce this system of taxation and terror, the Comanche developed a method of warfare that rendered traditional European military tactics completely obsolete. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European and American forces relied on the line of battle. A dragoon would ride to the battlefield, dismount, stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, and fire a single-shot muzzle-loading musket. It was a slow, rigid form of violence. The Comanche operated as a fluid, high-speed weapons platform. They delivered a kinetic payload that relied on overwhelming velocity and volume of fire. A Comanche warrior was physically integrated with the animal. Boys were taught to ride bareback, guiding the horse with their knees and shifting weight, leaving both hands entirely free. They perfected a maneuver where at a full gallop, the warrior would hook his heel over the horse's spine and drop his body down the side of the animal. From the perspective of an enemy soldier, the Comanche rider simply disappeared. The horse became a moving shield of meat and bone. From under the neck of the galloping horse, the warrior would unleash his payload. The primary weapon was not the clumsy, slow-loading musket, but the short bow engineered from orangewood or bighorn sheephorn and backed with animal sinew. These bows boasted a draw weight of up to 70 pounds. The physics were devastating. You have a warrior moving at 35 miles per hour firing a heavy iron-tipped arrow. The kinetic force of the galloping horse is added directly to the force of the bowstring. The resulting impact could drive an arrow completely through a massive bison's ribcage or punch straight through the thick leather armor of a Spanish dragoon. The rate of fire was unmatched. A skilled Comanche could fire 20 arrows accurately in the time it took a Spanish soldier to bite open a paper cartridge, pour powder, ram a lead ball home, and fire a single inaccurate musket shot. They utilized the Comanche circle. A war party would ride in a continuous swirling vortex around a trapped enemy. This revolving wheel of dust and flying arrows meant the enemy never had a stationary target to aim at. The Comanche would bleed a static formation to death without ever engaging in prolonged hand-to-hand combat. If the enemy counterattacked, the Comanche evaporated, melting into the horizon only to regroup 20 m away. They weaponized space and speed, ensuring every engagement was fought on their terms. Because we are accustomed to looking for governments and buildings, it is easy to mistake the Comanche for isolated bands of raiders. In reality, they operated as the central hub of a highly organized continental trade syndicate. They were the apex managers of the North American interior. They understood macroeconomics. They recognized that the horse was a fluctuating currency. In the Spanish provinces of the South, where horses were bred and easily stolen, they were cheap. But hundreds of miles north, among the agricultural tribes and the freezing plains of Canada, horses were incredibly rare and highly valued. The Comanche exploited this geographic arbitrage. They utilized their mobile procurement network to harvest thousands of horses from Mexico, then drove these massive herds north, trading them to the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and the French. In exchange, the Comanche received British and French manufactured goods, steel knives, copper kettles, and most importantly, firearms and powder. They acted as a massive armed conveyor belt, moving the resources of the South to the North and the technology of the North to the South. To protect this monopoly, they engaged in a ruthless campaign of geopolitical clearing. Before the Comanche arrived, the southern plains were heavily populated by the Apache. The Comanche systematically hunted the Apache, burning their camps and driving the survivors off the prime bison hunting grounds and into the harsh mountains of the desert Southwest. The Comanche created a massive exclusive buffer zone.